In this Duskmourn draft guide, I'm going to be going over everything you need to know about red-green. I'm going to be going over game plan, pick order, example trophy decks, and also extra tips that I picked up along the way. I've done a bunch of drafts on the way to Mythic this season, and I want to share with you what I've learned. So red-green is usually a aggressive delirium focused deck. The signpost cards for this archetype are exactly that. They are passable creatures and removal spells without delirium, but with delirium they are massively above rate, and they can both quickly turn an even board state into a very favourable one. There are a few colour combinations in Duskmourn that lend themselves to 3 colour builds, and red-green is one of them. Most likely they would splash blue or maybe black, rarely white. But for the purpose of this video, I will try and mostly focus on the 2 colour benefits. I'm looking to make a separate video in the future about 3 colours specifically. Before I dive into the card evaluations, I just want to break down how I think about things a little bit. I feel like step 1 of drafting is putting good cards in your deck. If you're bringing a knife to a gunfight, well, good luck. With that in mind, I will be quoting stats, but also giving my opinions. The stats are coming from 17lands.com, and I will be mostly quoting game in hand win rate, which is effectively how often you win after you draw a card in a game. I will also be talking about the concept of wheeling or tabling. This is when you see a card initially, maybe say pack one, pick one, and then it wheels around the table past the other 7 players and back to you again, so that on your 9th pick, or possibly later, you see the card again. In the example that I have here, I pick a red rare, and there's 2 other red cards in the pack, and then one of them tables back round to me. Potentially that could be a signal that red is open, but at least it's something to keep in mind. So an edge that you can get when drafting is knowing what other decks don't want, but your deck might, and then try and wheel those cards so that you get even more playables for your deck. Getting into the commons, we're starting with Scorching Dragonfire. For 2 mana, you get to deal 3 damage at instant speed and exile the creature that you or planeswalker that you hit. This is by far and away the best red common. Instant speed for its utility and also its ability to trigger delirium, and exiling is great in a format where other people also care about that. Spineseeker Centipede is a 2/1 for 3. When it comes into play, you can search your deck for a basic land, put it into your hand, and then if you have delirium triggered, then it becomes a 3/3 with vigilance. This is one of the best cards at enabling splashes. Even without that, just a 3/3 for 3 with vigilance when you're reliably triggering delirium, and that stops you from accidentally missing your land drops, it's no wonder that it has such a good win rate. Turn Inside Out is a combat trick that gives target creature +3/+0 until the end of turn, and when it dies, you manifest dread. This is great in every red aggressive deck, but in red-green you have some very efficient creatures that you can flip up off manifest dread to surprise somebody and ruin a combat step. Also, there are only so many instants you want to run in this deck, and this is one of the better ones. Because it is a combat trick, people do undervalue it and it can go very late, so keep in mind that you may wheel this, but also don't underestimate just how much it wins games. For 2 mana, we have Manifest Dread, which manifests dread. As mentioned before, there's some good things you can flip up here. It enables delirium by putting new things into the bin, it allows you to start filling your curve out and make sure you don't get too far behind at the start of the game. This is especially good in like green black and green red, so other decks may undervalue it a little bit, but you'll be very happy to play multiples of this card. Next we have Glasswork Shattered Yard, a room that can either deal 4 damage to target creature an opponent controls, or at the end of your end step, it can deal 1 damage to each opponent. Again, we're looking for diversity in card types, so having a useful enchantment is helpful. You don't really have ways to get extra value off this beyond its card type. You're not really looking to sacrifice it, you're not really looking to return it to your hand, but you do have some ways in green to return permanents from the graveyard to your hand rather than from in play to your hand. Still, it's just efficient at what it does. Terramorphic Expanse is quite high up here, a land that you can sacrifice to put a basic of any color into play tapped. Enabling delirium is important in this archetype, and allowing you to fix your mana just so that you get screwed less often is great too. Wary Watchdog is a 3/1 for 2. When it enters or dies, you surveil 1. Fills a very similar role to Manifest Dread, but just in this deck it's a little bit worse than Manifest Dread because you do have so many nice things you'd like to manifest. Next we have Clockwork Percussionist, a 1/1 for 1. Artifact creature with haste, and when it dies you can exile the top card of your library and you may cast it until the end of your next turn. You might think that this isn't particularly beefy and therefore why does it go in here? You know, it's not a 2/2 or a 3/3 at least, but it has 2 relevant types. It gives you card advantage in red, which is quite rare, and it's just extremely annoying to deal with. Do you just take 1 forever as the opponent, or do you have to deal with this and risk them getting something even better? There isn't really a good choice. It is also a very strong card that goes quite late. You may be able to wheel it. Say Its Name is a 2-cost sorcery that mills 3 cards, and then you may return a creature or a land from your graveyard to your hand. If you happen to have 3 or more of them in your graveyard, then you can search all your zones for Altanak, a 9/9 trample creature with some extra relevant text, and put them straight into play. Say its name is an amazing delirium enabler, and you also have some big large creatures you want to get back later on, although I would warn that it can sometimes put you behind. In this deck with things like haste creatures and quite efficient removal, it's not so much of a downside. Next we have Monstrous Emergence, 2-cost sorcery removal that says you pick a creature to deal damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls, whether that creature be in play or in your hand. This is one of the decks that uses Monstrous Emergence the best because it has multiple large creatures that it can use to trade up with, but you'd still run to take some of the instant speed exiling red removal over this if you can. Next is Ticket Booth Tunnel of Hate, a room that can either manifest red for 3 or give target attacking creature double strike until the end of turn. Again, relevant types, it is an enchantment and it does manifest red, so it can also fill the graveyard that way. And double strike is no joke when you have trample creatures and large creatures. Being able to use this on, say, Wicker Folk can very quickly finish a game. Finally, out of the commons you're quite happy to be running is Impossible Inferno. For 5 mana, it's instant and it deals 6 damage to target creature. With Delirium enabled, you exile the top card of your library and you may play it until the end of your next turn. Again, instant speed is very relevant and it ends up being card advantage more often than not. These next few cards are filler commons. They are fine to put in your deck, but there are better versions of them usually. I will point out Most Valuable Slayer is actually very good in this particular build. Being able to give very large creatures first strike and +1 does make them near unblockable. Again, combos great with trample if you have it. And these last cards are ones that you just really do not want to put into your deck. Either they're a bad rate or they're just something that doesn't really fit into what this deck wants to do. Getting into the best uncommons, we have Under the Skin. For 3 mana, a sorcery, you get to manifest dread, and then you can return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand. The ordering is important here. You get to manifest first. So if you see, say, a land and a creature, you can pick which one of them you want to put in your hand versus having in play. And in the late game, being able to get back a bomb or a relevant other permanent that you might want is very helpful. Just the flexibility and rate of this card makes it a very high pick. Next is Patchwork Beastie. For 1 mana you get a 3/3 which can't attack or block unless you have Delirium enabled, but luckily this card builds 1 each turn on your upkeep. This is the Patchwork Beastie deck. It is 2 types itself, it works great in multiples, it helps to enable Delirium for itself, and it's just kind of a big green creature. Few decks may pass this up because if they don't care about Delirium and they're not in green, it's not for them. It's not exactly the kind of card you would splash, but in this deck it is extremely powerful. The first of the signpost cards, Wildfire Wicker Folk, is here. For red and green you get a 3/2 with haste, and if you have Delirium enabled it gets +1/+1 and trample. Same as Patchwork, it is 2 types, which is great at enabling Delirium in your deck. And you know, a 3/2 with haste is fine, but a 4/3 with haste and trample is really, really good. It's terrifying having these come out of nowhere and attack you, and that's before you even mention the combat tricks you could be running. Again, people might pass this late because of the heavy color requirement, but if I were you, I would slam this card. Fear of Burning Alive is a 6 mana enchantment creature. It's a 4/4 that when it enters, you deal 4 damage to each opponent. If you have Delirium enabled, then it will take that 4 damage and also deal it to another creature. It has some non-creature combat damage combos that it enables, but generally you're just going to be doing 4 damage once. So red-green isn't too worried about having some slightly large creatures. This is a great way to finish off a game or get through an annoying blocker, and is also a prime target for recurring from your graveyard back to your hand again, as well as itself being 2 types for Delirium. Next we have Razorkin Horde Caller, a 4/4 with haste for 5, that whenever you attack with any creature, you create a 1/1 red gremlin token. This doesn't have any special synergy, it's just efficiently costed. You don't particularly care about extra tokens, it only has 1 type, but it doesn't matter, this is just a good card. The second signpost card is Beastie Beatdown. For red and green at sorcery, you get to pick a creature you control and it deals damage equal to its power to target creature and opponent controls, and if you have Delirium, then before you do that, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on your creature. So as I said before, this is fine before Delirium, but with Delirium it is a beating. Quite often opponents will be in a position where they're just kind of praying you can't hit Delirium, because if you do, then you're going to run them over. Putting this on a trample creature and then pushing through is going to deal a bunch of damage on that turn, and then if they can't kill that creature the following turn, they just lose the game. Betrayer's Bargain is a 2-cost instant speed removal spell that does 5 damage to target creature and then exiles it. As an additional cost, you either have to sacrifice an enchantment or creature or pay 2. Red-green doesn't have lots of fodder outside of, say, Percussionist or maybe some of the rooms you might run, so often you will end up paying 4 for this, but it doesn't really matter, it's still a very good card at 4 cost. Next we have Piggy Bank, a 3/2 for 3 artifact creature that when it dies you also get a treasure token. You've got some big things you like to ramp into, it's got 2 relevant creature types, and it's a 3/2 rather than a 2/2 for 2, so it does a lot of little things well. Next is Fear of Being Hunted, a 4/2 with haste for 3 that must be blocked if able. 2 types, what we like to see, and having some extra control over how combat goes down can be very useful. Threats Around Every Corner is a 4 cost enchantment. When it comes into play, you manifest Dread, and then whenever you manifest Dread, you get to search your library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped. The card is great for enabling splashes into other colors, but also ramping into larger creatures. And as we've said, Manifest Dread also amazing at enabling Delirium. Irreverent Gremlin is a 2/2 for 2 with Menace, and whenever another creature you control with power 2 or less enters, you may discard a card and then draw a card, and you can only do this once each turn. This deck isn't full of 2/2s, it has an okay number of them with the manifest that you're doing, but this is just a very good 2-drop, and again, being able to discard cards helps with enabling Delirium. Conductive Machete is an equipment for 4 that manifests Dread when it comes in, and then attaches this equipment to the creature, giving it +2/+1. You can also then re-equip later for 4 mana. There are already quite a few artifacts that you're happy to run, so this isn't a super high priority in this deck, but it does what this deck wants to do. It manifests Dread, it can pump up your creatures and keep them attacking through enemy blockers. Insidious Fungus is a 1 cost 1/2 with a pay 2 sacrifice and pick 1. Either destroy target artifact or enchantment, or draw a card and then put a land from your hand into play tapped. On the surface, this doesn't really look like it fits the game plan of red-green aggro stuff, but it is a way to get a creature into the graveyard, but mostly you're in this for the utility. It is strong just to have options. Speaking of options, we have Break Down the Door, 3 cost instant speed card that says exile target artifact or enchantment or manifest Dread. Exiling is great, options are great, instant speed is quite rare in this deck, and sometimes you're just going to ambush somebody with Manifest Dread and win the combat that way. Wickerfolk Thresher is a 5/4 for 4 artifact creature with Delirium. Whenever it attacks, look at the top card of your library, and if it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield, and if not, then you can put it into your hand. This is a slightly more aggressive leaning creature that steadily gains value. I'd say it's definitely at its best in this deck over any other one, but still I would prioritize like the good 2 and 3 drops a little bit higher. Finally, out of the best uncommons, we have Defiant Survivor, a 3/2 for 3 with survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if this is tapped, manifest Dread. So there are a few relevant combat tricks and pump spells that you may use in red-green to keep this alive, and also just enough of removal that you might be able to clear the board entirely and just attack with it without any blockers in place. As we mentioned many times, Manifest Dread is amazing in this deck, and so despite survival often being a bit iffy, it's worth the risk here. So next is the filler uncommons, ones that are fine, but not what you're really looking for. I will shout out Violent Urge. It is made for the red-green deck where you can reliably get Delirium and have a big enough creature that you are excited about giving it double strike, but it just needs a few too many things to go right for you to want to pick it highly. Another kind of interesting card is Painter Studio Deface Gallery, which is really good in the go white aggressive decks like red-white, but is significantly worse in this deck because you have a smaller number of large creatures. And then finally, we just have the kind of bad uncommons you don't really want to be running no matter what. Is unfortunately Pyroclasm is just kind of bad in a format where everybody wants to be making 2/2s. Looking through the trophy decks, you will see that a lot of these are very aggressive leaning and have a good amount of efficient 2 drops. Also, many of them have multiple Patchwork Beasties, must be nice. So, final tips. As you're drafting, try and be mindful of what type of deck it looks like you're going to end up with. I think ideally you do want to be aggressive and Delirium focused, so be mindful of how many types of each thing you have. Do you have enough enchantments? Do you have enough instants? Do you have enough artifacts to be able to reliably enable Delirium? Try and adjust your pick order accordingly to keep them balanced. But if you can't get an aggressive deck, or you've ended up splashing, then know that you need enough stuff in the late game to justify going a little bit slower. Maybe you care less about Inside Out or Clockwork Percussionist in that deck, but you need a good amount of relevant 5 and 6 drops and efficient removal to keep you alive and pay you off for surviving. If you found this helpful, I've been making some other color pair guides and you can find them linked here in a playlist.